Hey guys, Miss Sailor here. So we're still talking about the American Revolution this week, but we are focusing today on the Declaration of Independence. Now, in part 2, I talked a bit about Thomas Paine and common sense. See, his ideas for an American republic and republicanism, the political philosophy of elected officials, and the governing of states and not having a monarchy. These words have such a deep effect on what is written later. Okay. See, in the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress, they meet in Philadelphia and they agree to sever ties with Great Britain. You have Virginian Thomas Jefferson and John Adams of Massachusetts. With the support of Congress, they begin articulating the justification for liberty in the Declaration of Independence, right? So, the more memorable date is July the 4th, 1776, when the Congress formally adopted the Declaration, thus creating the United States of America. It was crucially important, not simply because it marked the creation of a new nation, but because of the ideas it expressed and the grievances it listed. Over the previous 10 years, colonists had deplored acts of Parliament that impinged on their freedoms. Now Jefferson, he's taking that because of Thomas Paine, and he's directing that colonial resentment at King George III himself. He's arguing that the monarch should have reined in Parliament's efforts, that it never should have gotten to this point. And in addition to highlighting the efforts to tax the colonists and restrict their liberties, he's asserting that there is truths that are self-evident, that all men are created equal and independent, and that they have the right to create governments of their own choosing. See, governments, he explained, derive their powers from the consent of the people, who are entitled to alter or even abolish them when they deny their citizens their inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, so it's adopted July 4th. It's written in part by Thomas Jefferson. There were 4 other writers, including John Adams. The first to sign was John Hancock. What they're basically stating is that they are a new independent nation and that they are no longer under British law, period. End of story. The preamble actually states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights governments are instituted among men. They derive their power from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish them. Okay? These guys, and they're smart. They think smart, okay? They don't just send copies of this to France or to Britain. They send copies to France and Spain. They're hoping to win their support. If they can win their support and get foreign recognition, it can create a lot of open doors for them. So they're very smart. Now, John Hancock first signed. He also signs the largest. Now, everyone else wrote kind of small, but John Hancock writes his signature very large under the guise that he wanted King George III to see his signature when he signed it. Okay? Now, I want to mention, because it's worth mentioning, the Declaration also reveals a fundamental contradiction of the American Revolution. You have the conflict between the existence of slavery and the idea that all men are created equal. 1/5 of the population in 1776 is enslaved. And at the time that he drafted the Declaration, Jefferson himself owned more than 100 slaves. Further, the Declaration framed equality as existing only among white men. Women and people of color are entirely left out of the document. Nonetheless, the promise of equality for all planted the seeds for future struggles waged by slaves and women and many others to bring about its full realization. All right, but yes. So what's in the Declaration? We talked about the unalienable rights. That's life, liberty, the pursuit of happinesses. The grievances against King George, obviously the ones that we've discussed: taxation without representation, the quartering of soldiers. These are issues that they are having with the king. Now, historians, we'll do this slide first. So we have where they're tearing down King George's statue in New York, July 9th, 1776. They actually melted this down and reused them as cannonballs to fire at the British later on. Now, historians still debate what exactly causes the revolution, right? The American Revolution. See, in 1775 and 76, Americans not only were not overly poor, their diet is better than most Europeans. Their lifespans are longer. They had higher free property ownership. And even with the mess of taxation, even the new ones imposed in 1763 are not as great as those imposed on the British people back in Great Britain. Many of the American colonists are indifferent. They're hesitant or even actively opposed to the idea of rebellion, more than half of them. So why even revolt? Some people argue that it's the clumsy efforts of the British to tighten the control of trade, the restrictions of colonists, and they're eager to acquire those western lands. There's the growing tax burden, the mounting debt of British merchants, the lack of representation in Parliament. And then you have these radicals in the colonies like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry, who are stirring up a lot of anti-British feelings. So all these things are just building and building and building. Mostly what Americans hated was this effort to constrict their civil liberties. You're denying their rights as British citizens, and that ends up just being the fire starter. See, the revolution reflected the shared political notion that all citizens are equal and independent, and that all government authority had to be based on long-standing constitutional principles and the consent of the governed. So, Americans want to trade freely with the world. They want to expand what Jefferson calls their empire of liberty. This is what they're trying to stress. Now, when they do fight this war, I'm just going to touch on it before we actually get into the war. The odds greatly favored the British, all right? Fewer than half of the 2.5 million colonists fought against it. Our patriots. Fewer than 2.5 million, so than half of them. There are 2.5 million, and only about half of them, really less, are actually patriots who actively supported the revolution. You have the 13 independent states that have a newly untested governments. This is where I'm going to bring in this slide just to touch on the articles. Next week is when we actually really touch on this early government. But the Continental Congress is struggling to serve as a national government. it doesn't have a lot of power. And then at the same time, you have General George Washington, who finds himself in charge of an inexperienced and poorly equipped army of amateurs. All right, they are facing Britain, who at the time is the world's greatest military power. This is not good. Equally important to the Revolutionary War, the revolutionary cause, was the decision by France and later the Spanish and the Dutch to join the fight, against Britain. The Franco-American alliance, which is negotiated in 1778, was the turning point for the war, which I will discuss later in length. And in 1783, after 8 years of sporadic fighting, the British do give up their American colonies, which, with the deeply ingrained resentment of British imperial rule, it leads Americans to give more power to the individual states and create a weak national government called the Confederation. And it fails ultimately. But that's where I'm going to end today, because we will be discussing Valley Forge and the other battles, and how Washington is having to deal with inexperienced and poorly equipped army personnel. Okay?